Hi, I have done some things on this book here. David Benatar, Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence. Now, I have, I have two other videos. There's chapter 2 and chapter 3 I've done videos on. So, those two videos I will put in a link down here. So those chapters, the second chapter I did a video on is called Why Coming into Existence is Always a Harm, which is where Benatar discusses what the harm is in actually existing. And he talks about like the asymmetries of pleasure and pain, and why they're not the same, and like he kind of refutes some optimistic arguments that say that, well, there are a lot of conditions where the pleasure can outweigh the pain or bad things in life, and Benatar argues that no, there's not really a way of, and that pleasure and pain are different enough that the pain is gonna, I guess I way better explain it in those videos, so go watch those videos to understand that. But in the second one he talks about just how pleasure and pain are not exactly, mostly that the optimistic assessments are not exactly reliable, and that they don't really give much weight into why existence is a harm or not. But there's a lot more in this video about here on chapter 2, so go there, and I have a discussion there about it. 3 is how bad is coming into how bad is coming into existence. I have a video or 2 on that also, which is also done here. And that first of all, it goes through various theories, hedonistic desire for fulfillment and objective list theories, and how shows how quality of life ends up badly in all of them. And he discusses why self assessments of the quality of life are reliable, or like how people who are doing well in their assessments of what their of the quality of life are not really reliable for analysis like this. And it discusses like the kind of suffering that there is in the world, and how bad it is. So this fourth one that I want to discuss today is having children, the antinatal view. Now I'm not going to discuss this whole chapter, because half the chapter is about procreation, and part of the chapter is about procreation and the duty to procreate or not to procreate, and the rest of it is about procreative freedom, the right to to procreate or not, or stuff like that. But I'm interested primarily in the duty not to procreate, because antinatalists, what their arguments always are, is that the suffering and the harm of existence is always going to lead you to the argument that you have a duty to not have children because of the suffering that your child could endure. So the antinatalists, YouTube as well as elsewhere, are going to argue with you that because of the harm of coming into existence, as well as how bad that harm actually is for the person who exists, that there's a great chance for the person who exists to regret his existence because of the pain and suffering and all the possible bad things that could happen to you, and that it could not possibly be regrettable to not exist, because the person who does not exist, there's no way that could be regrettable. There's no way it could be there's no way it could be regrettable or not regrettable. So there's no existence there. So it's like it's logically that state of non-existence is automatically referred to as the better state of affairs, rather than existence where you could be exposed to all these things and all this harm and suffering. So that is the logic of the antinatalists. So, and I guess I myself am not an antinatalist at all. I agree with Benatar's ideas about why coming into existence is always a harm and how bad it is. I agree with all of that. I agree with chapters 2 and 3. But what I do not agree with is the 4th chapter, having chosen the antinatal view. I do not agree. I guess I'm going into this. I want to say at the outset that I'm a religious person who I'm not an ignorant religious person, and I'm going to look over a certain argument before I passively reject it. Like, I mean, I used to have this, because I mean, most Christians are going to have this optimistic view about life and towards antinatalists of how, they're going to paint this pretty picture of rainbows and roses and everything, that showing that, no, it's not all this bad, and that how you can have pleasures that outweigh the pains or the sufferings. That's not me. And most Christians, if they understand, if they understand the Bible well enough, they will understand that God even says that, or the word in the Lord even says himself that this place is a place of suffering and pain and bad things, and that's what this is. And the coming into existence is always a harm here, and it's always in how bad it is. It's true. I totally agree. But the difference between antinatalists and educated Christian is that an educated Christian has a different way of going about it than choosing not to procreate. But it's not the debate here is not an issue of procreating or not procreating. It's whether there's a moral duty to not procreate or not. And that is the big question I have here. But first of all, I want to read the very end of chapter 3. I want to read this world of suffering here, which is this is the very end of chapter 3, which gives where Benatar gives stats about suicide and all these things. Such is the strength of Pollyannism. Pollyannism is the influence that you're going to get, that things are that's like the optimistic influence, or the I explained that better in the last video about Benatar's book. Such is the strength of Pollyannism that the foregoing sort of pessimism is often dismissed as self-pitying winging of existential weaklings. Optimists make valiant attempts to paint a rosy picture, to put a redeeming positive gloss on the human predicament, or at least to show a brave face. Pessimists find these unseemly, akin to jocularity or cheering at a funeral. Arthur Schopenhauer, one of my favorite philosophers, for example, says of optimism that where it is not merely the thoughtless talk of those who harbor nothing but the word under their shallow foreheads, seems to be not merely an absurd but also a really wicked way of thinking, a bitter mockery of the unspeakable suffering of mankind. So that is some really deep words. Very, very deep words there. And that sums up right there, I think, is sums up very well what Benatar is saying in this particular chapter. Whether or not one accepts that the pessimistic view I've presented or of ordinary healthy life, the optimist is surely on very, very weak ground where one considers the amount of unequivocal suffering the world contains. Consider first natural disasters. More than 15 million people are thought to have died from such disasters in the last 1,000 years. In the last few years, flooding, for example, has killed an estimated 20,000 annually and brought suffering to tens of millions. The number is greater in some years. In late December 2004, a few 100,000 people lost their lives in a tsunami. Approximately 20,000 people die every day from hunger. An estimated 840 million people suffer from hunger and malnutrition without dying from it. That is a sizable proportion of the approximately 6.3 billion people who currently live. How many people was that? 20,000 people die every day from hunger. An estimated 840 million people suffer from hunger and malnutrition without dying from it. And that's a sizable proportion of the approximately 6.3 billion people who currently live. But is that greater than 50%? No. Disease ravages and kills millions annually. Consider plague, for example. Between 541 CE and 1912, it is estimated that over 102 million people succumbed to plague. Remember that the human population during this period was just a fraction of its current size. The 1918 influenza epidemic killed 50 million people. Given the size of the current world human population and the increased speed and volume of global travel, a new influenza epidemic could cause millions more deaths. HIV currently kills nearly 3 million people annually. If we add all other infectious diseases, we get a total of nearly 11 million deaths per year. And he's giving a lot of notes here which give sources to this, so he's not just spitting out things. Malignant neoplasms take more than a further 7 million lives each year, usually after considerable and often protracted suffering. Add the approximately 3.5 million accidental deaths, including over a million road accidents each year. When all other deaths are added, a colossal sum of approximately 56.5 million people died in 2001. That is more than 170 people per minute. As the world human population grows, the number of deaths increases. In some parts of the world where infant mortality is high, many of these deaths will follow within a few years of birth. Even when life expectancy is greater, we know that more birth leads to more death. Now multiply the number of deaths by the number of family and friends who survive to mourn and miss the departed. For every death, there are many more bereft who grieve for the deceased. Although much disease is attributable to human behavior, consider the more intentionally caused suffering that some members of our species inflict on others. One authority estimates that before the 20th century, over 133 million people were killed in mass killings. According to the same author, the first 88 years of the 20th century saw 170 million, possibly as many as 360 million people shot, beaten, tortured, knifed, burned, starved, frozen, crushed, or worked to death, buried alive, drowned, hanged, bombed, or killed in any of the myriad ways governments have inflicted death on unarmed, helpless citizens and foreigners. Millions of people obviously are killed during wars. According to the World Report on Violence and Health, there were 1.6 million conflict-related deaths in the 16th century, 6.1 million in the 17th century, 7 million in the 18th, 19.4 million in the 19th, 109.7 million in the most bloody of centuries, the 20th. The World Health Organization estimates
that war-related injuries led to 310,000 deaths in 2000, a year that does not stand out in our minds as being particularly bloody. And then he talks about people who are raped, assaulted, maimed, or murdered, whether they died or not from the raping, assaulting, and maiming. So he's talking about like all this suffering here. Great suffering could await any person that is brought into existence. Even the most privileged people could give birth to a child that will suffer unbearably, be raped, assaulted, or be murdered brutally. The optimist surely bears the burden of justifying this procreational Russian roulette. Given that there are no real advantage over never existing for those who are brought into existence, it is hard to see how the significant risk of serious harm could be justified if we count not only the unusually severe harms that anybody can endure, but also the quite routine ones of ordinary human life. But then we find that the matters are still worse for cheery procreators. It shows that they play Russian roulette with a fully loaded gun, aimed, of course, not at their own heads, but those of their future offspring.
So that's pretty much that's the suffering. That's true. These are true stats about suffering. Now, I would like to discuss only a certain part of this chapter, having children, the antinatal view, the one about procreation.
I have argued so far that coming into existence is always a harm, and that it is a serious harm. There is more than one way to reach this conclusion. Those who reject the arguments in chapter 2 and that coming into existence is always harm may nonetheless be persuaded by the arguments in chapter 3 that our lives are actually very bad. Even those who deny that all lives are very bad should conclude from chapter 3 that at least the overwhelming majority of lives are very bad. These conclusions must certainly have bearing on the question of having children, by which I mean the generation of children rather than rearing them. Okay. And then here, is there a duty not to procreate? Do my arguments also show that it is actually wrong to have children? That is to say, is there a duty not to procreate, or is procreation neither obligatory nor prohibited? Many people will agree that there is sometimes a duty not to procreate, namely those cases where the child one brings into existence will have an unusually bad life. My question, however, is whether duty not to bring people into existence applies to all possible people. An affirmative answer would be sharply antagonistic to some of the most deeply seated and powerful human drives. So then he creates these possible interests of why one would procreate. There's the procreative interest, the coital interest, and the parenting interest. The procreative interest is to bringing new people, genetic offspring, into existence. Coital interests is Benatar says coital interests are interested in a kind of sexual union, coitus, and that's the only interest there. And then parenting interests are interested in rearing a child, as well as interested in the relationship established with the adult children one has raised. So he talks about how the reasons for procreating would be either the procreation interests or the coital interests, or it could be the interest of the child itself. And Benatar, given his second and third chapter, has shown that it wouldn't be possible that we could be morally doing this for
the interest of the offspring being born, because the last two chapters show that there's so much suffering and so many bad things that could happen to so many bad things that could happen to the offspring, no matter where the parents are. It's inevitable. So then the real question is, I could accept that non-procreation should only be required when the children produced would lead to very poor quality lives. This is because I have argued that all lives fall into this category. It seems then that those who accept that coming into existence is a great harm, and then there's a duty not to procreate in cases where the offspring would suffer great harm by being brought into existence, but accept that a duty not to procreate is too demanding. So then he thinks about the duty to procreate being too demanding, and then he thinks about this. If I'm mistaken about this, however, and it is not immoral to have children, my arguments in chapters 2 and 3 at the very least show that it is preferable not to have children. Although our potential offspring may not regret coming into existence, they would certainly not regret not coming into existence, since it is actually very much not in their interest to come into being. The morally desirable course of action is to ensure that they do not. Since it is actually very much not in their interests to come into being, the morally desirable course of action is to ensure that they do not. Okay, now, here's I guess I have a different agenda for discussing this. In these 3 chapters, he discusses that that pleasure and pain can't be that pleasure cannot be factored in light of the suffering, mostly, and that the offspring are being imposed upon because they don't have a choice. And essentially, what is being stated here is that because of the myriad of things that could happen to the offspring, that there is a duty to not procreate and not create them. But the whole thing is that in my opinion, Benatar is arguing that lives are very harmful and they're bad. I view life and existence as harmful, yes. Very, very harmful. Bad? No. I don't view them as bad. And bad, I guess, can be, phrased as wrong, or bad and wrong. Those could be phrased, differently. But, I guess, where's my... I guess what I'm trying to say here is that there's a factor that's not exactly taken into account, because he takes into account the possibility of all these pleasures and pains and desires that could be fulfilled in light of all the suffering, but there's something that isn't being taken into account. And I mean, I could be wrong for saying this, but there's a principle called fulfillment. Now, this could be tied into the principle by Charles Taylor. Well, not by Charles Taylor, but is something that Charles Taylor talks about. It's called the principle of authenticity. This is a term in existentialism as well as philosophy surrounding it. This is but fulfillment in this case. I would view fulfillment here. I'm just trying to create a concept here. So just bear with me here, because I'm trying to create a concept, not create a concept. I'm trying to think of a concept that, in light of Benatar's stats about suffering, in life right now, people do not. There are optimists and there are pessimists, but the optimists, most optimists that are opposing the antinatalists, they look at life in terms of either desires or pleasures and pains, or both, and then look at it from a consequential standpoint. And the whole thing is that, like, Benatar has shown that whole pleasure pain bivalence is to not work in justifying the fact that it's not moral or immoral to procreate. Because what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to argue with this certain concept of fulfillment. I'm trying to argue here that it's not moral or immoral to procreate. There's no duty to procreate or to not procreate. And that this is not something that that should have anything to do with morality, because this whole idea of fulfillment, fulfillment in a life, it could happen at any time, and I'm thinking about this idea of fulfillment as this idea of fulfillment as the person, the subject, achieving some sort of ends or a purpose, whatever purpose. Like, let's say subject A gets abused early in her life, and gets raped later in life also, and goes through so much pain through that and suffering because of those things, and ends up not really getting over those things because it's so painful, and not really fully getting over them, but using the things that happened to her to help women who have gone through the same things, to get through them, as much as possible. Now that would be a form of fulfillment, because there's some sort of purpose being fulfilled. Now, I want to view this as some sort of fulfillment in the form that I'm trying to explain this without assuming too much for this, because if I assume too much to this principle, it's gonna end up being too heavy and will not work within the thing I'm trying to argue. Fulfillment meaning that the person gains some sort of purpose that makes life not so meaningless. Makes life maybe still pretty meaningless, but there's some sort of thing that is going on that may start as very minute or very, very remote, and something very small and doesn't really matter that much, but can, through everything in life, it could become something more, to where, whatever possibility or whatever purpose or end, or it could possibly a niche within the world, or a niche within the, world or the community, some sort of niche somewhere where some sort of purpose the subject is so fulfilling, so that this happens enough that there is some sort of agreeability to this life. And I'm not saying that they're getting pleasure from this. I'm trying to argue some sort of neutral, dull sense of happiness, not happiness based on pleasures and desires, happiness based on agreeability. Agreeability meaning, this, even all of the shitty things that have happened, I have, kind of, things have kind of turned out all right, I guess, and that to the point where the subject finds the life that he or she has had agreeable enough that he does not regret it. To, like, where it becomes agreeable enough, just agreeable enough, the life becomes just agreeable enough to the point where the subject does not regret it, and not necessarily is happy that it happened, but just enough agreeability because of this fulfillment and purpose or niche, that there's no regret. Now, this could happen when the subject is 20 and then die right after that, or it could happen when the subject is 90. It could take a small amount of time or a very long amount of time, 80 years of nothing and suffering and pain in their life, and then, within a period of 10 years, gets this purposeful fulfillment or something like that. Now, this is just enough agreeability in the life to where there's enough, because of this fulfillment has given him some agreeability in light of all the pleasures and in light of all the suffering and all that stuff, where in light of all of this, in light of all the suffering and everything, and then we have this fulfillment, this purpose, which makes all of that not in vain, and it makes a small, even a tiny amount of agreeability, which just makes that life not regrettable, and that he or she does not regret it. Now, I'm talking about this possibility. The idea is the question here is, how possible is this in certain lives? Now, we need to look at those. I want to look at those stats again that Benatar gave in the last chapter. All of those, in all of those lives, there's a great majority, I think. The majority of the lives in this world are lives that could achieve this fulfillment. This fulfillment where life becomes agreeable enough to where it's not, to where the subject doesn't regret it, and it's just all right enough that the subject doesn't regret it. And they're like, well, this was all right. I've kind of had some sort of niche now, and in light of all this suffering and everything, and all the things I've been through, and after all these things I've been doing and stuff like that, with this fulfillment, I don't regret it like I have used to in the 10, 20, 80, 60, however many years I have regretted it, my existence. So the question here is, given all of the people who all the stats that Benatar gives, all the stats of um, all the stats of people dying from starvation, war, um, disease, and um, all of those things that all those things where the disasters, murder, all those things that could shorten a life to the point where this fulfillment is not possible within that life. The person is not alive long enough. And then there's also a certain section of people where there's disability. Now, I'm not talking disability where there's, mild mental disability. I'm talking like uh, a profound disability, to where the brain can't function enough beyond kindergarten level or something like that. Those really severe disabilities will cause suffering and will not allow for fulfillment to be possible. But the majority of disabilities, like somebody who's quadriplegic or paraplegic, those people who have, I mean, I'm not saying that those disabilities are mild, mind you. I'm saying that they are very bad, hard disabilities. But through most of those disabilities and diseases and hardships, there's a possibility for this kind of fulfillment. It's possible, but then there is a certain percentage, certain smaller percentage of people who die early, who starve all their life and then finally die of Ebola or AIDS or something like that, to where it's not, to where the fulfillment isn't possible. There's a certain percentage, and what I get from Benatar's stats, as well as some other things, there is much less than 50% of people who either die early or where their brains aren't formed well enough, or just suffer way too much, where this fulfillment principle is not possible in their life. There's a certain percentage, and I know that it's less than 50% of the population in the world. Less than 50% of the population. Now that is for certain, because there's so many people who live in this world. So many. And all of them suffer in one way or another. But more than 50% of the people who live on this earth, whenever they live or die, more than 50% of people on this earth have a possibility for this fulfillment. They have a possibility for it. There's a lot of suffering where life is gonna be regrettable for most of their life, but then towards the end, or possibly in the middle, or whenever, they're gonna have this purpose or end or niche where they're interacting with whatever, interacting with something, and that they're fulfilling their own some kind of purpose, and they experience this fulfillment where agreeability towards this life raises a little bit. I'm not saying this is happiness. This is agreeability. I'm talking mild. This is okay now. I think I'm doing kind of okay now. To where it gets towards where life is not regrettable. Life still sucks and everything, and I wish a lot of these things didn't happen. But in light of this new fulfillment, I do not regret it anymore. Now I hope that people who are watching this and are antinatalist, I hope that you are sort of understanding this principle before you shoot this down as an optimistic formulation of suffering, because it's not. It's not. It's more of a principle which it's more of a principle which shows that there's something beyond just pain and pleasure, because there's more than beyond just pain and pleasure, which Benatar clearly shows that pleasure is not something that can even be compared to pain, and thus optimistic formulations fail, which I believe is true. This is not one of those. This is not a species of those at all. This is more of a formulation to show that there is a different option between having a good amount of pleasure, a good amount of pain, whatever, pain and pleasure, this, that, or whatever. There's an option beyond that supposed bivalence. And my point here is that I think that Benatar stats show well more that more than 50% of the population within the last 10 years at least more than 50% of the population within the last 10 years at least are people who suffer greatly and yet are able to still have the possibility in their life, are not too severely disabled or not too severely maimed, or don't die that early, that are able to achieve this kind of fulfillment or niche or ends or purpose. And if that's true, and I believe it is, I believe that's true. If that's true, then that means that 50% of people could end up not regretting life. If that's the whole more than 50% of the population thing is true, or at least arguable as a sound argument, then I believe it's true, and I believe it's a very sound argument that more than 50% of the population within the last 10 years have the possibility for this fulfillment, because they're not. Most of them are not too far maimed, too far disabled, or don't die too early. Because there's 6.3 billion people in the world, as Benatar said when he wrote this, 6.3 billion, and I assume there's way more now. That more than 50% of people in the world have the possibility for this concept of fulfillment. And if that's true, which I think it is, and I'll say it again, if that's true, and I think it is, that 50% of the population could end up not regretting their life. And if that's, I think that's true. I think I've argued this soundly so far. I think that, given the things I've argued thus far, that procreation does not have a stance of. Procreation does not have. Procreation is not immoral. There's no morality in it. It's not immoral, and it's not moral either. Procreation is not immoral. You cannot give a stance of morality on this case, on this